Accessibility. It means access, clarity, and inclusion. For many years, Canada has seen the introduction of many accessibility laws, and Canadians themselves seem to embrace this trend. Except, it would seem, the leader of the federal NDP who would end up creating confusion and reducing accessibility. Listen to this episode that talks about the latest political gimmickry in Canada's national election.
Podcast starts now.
Today, we have a bunch of laws and regulations across Canada that aim to make information and communications more understandable, more accessible to all levels of linguistic and intellectual ability, and thus more inclusive of all Canadians. These laws exist in pretty much every province. We even have a national law called Accessibility Canada Act. It took years and years of hard advocacy to get those laws in place. I should know. Many years ago, I was one of many people who drove some of those advocacy campaigns and who later helped write the legislation in Ottawa and in many provincial capitals. Having those laws in place today really amounts to a leveling of the playing field of opportunity to participate. The laws affect areas like the physical built environment, for example, and communication and information. So let's focus on the communication and information realm. What this has meant for people is less confusion, better understanding. For example, non-native English or French speakers, people with intellectual disabilities, people with brain injury, and many older people who live with dementia. These are groups in our society that really benefit from these laws on communication and information. It gives them hope and a breath of fresh air that they can more easily and independently navigate the world around them. Some examples include retail websites that are easier to navigate, restaurant menus that are clear and legible, signage that clearly indicates direction or instruction, street and place names that clearly convey location, or subway station names that convey a place and that are easily understood by everyone. And for most people today, the question is, well, why wouldn't we do that? The answer is that different mindsets at different times didn't consider how communication and information might be confusing or misunderstood by certain groups of people. It just wasn't top of mind. But today, making communication and information more accessible is not just the right thing to do in Canada, it happens to be the law. And here's where we get to the point of this episode. So, sorry folks, but we had to get that quick explanation out of the way first. With all of that in mind, you'll probably find it as ironic as I do that the leader of the federal NDP, a party that claims to represent those without a voice, and a party that is committed to inclusion and accessibility, finds it acceptable to move in the opposite direction and make information and communications even more confusing. How's he doing that? The leader pledges that the riding of Toronto-Danforth will, if the NDP is elected to form the government that is, rename the riding to Toronto-Layton. We recently saw some observing the 10th anniversary of the death of former NDP leader Jack Layton, which prompted a handful of online tributes, and the current NDP leader's seemingly spontaneous pledge to honor the late Mr. Layton by renaming an electoral district in his honor. Now, I don't want to get into today's controversy about place or entity names that honor past individuals, but I do want to point out that the existing name Toronto-Danforth contains the name of the city in which the riding is located and features the name of the biggest avenue that runs through the middle of the riding. Clear, geographically identifying, easy to understand, non-controversial. Accessibility for everyone. By renaming it to Toronto-Layton moves things in the opposite direction. In other words, he pledges to eliminate the geographic clarity of the riding's existing name, while also adding confusion about where a newly named Toronto-Layton actually is. This announcement is in no way consistent with inclusive social goals or accessibility legislation. The irony is amplified by the fact that the NDP have historically been the first party to not only endorse the introduction of such accessibility laws, but actually embed that commitment in their party's bylaws. It's in their DNA. Okay, full disclosure. I'm in no way a supporter of the NDP politically, never have been. Although I believe historically they have made grand contributions to public policy development and discussion in this country. There's that. Also, once upon a time I worked for the former Liberal Member of Parliament in Toronto-Danforth, Dennis Mills. I was there when the riding was a little smaller and used to be called Broadview Greenwood, and was later given the appropriate moniker Toronto-Danforth as the riding and population got bigger. The name was clear and understandable when the boundaries were the avenues of Broadview and Greenwood, and the very same rationale was used to modernize the name to Toronto-Danforth when Elections Canada enlarged the boundaries considerably. And by the way, that rationale in modernizing the riding's name was used many, many years before the official introduction of any laws that mandated accessibility in information and communication. Perhaps the leader can be forgiven for not realizing that accessibility is both a highly welcome trend and public policy objective today, not to mention being a law in most provinces and at the federal level. After all, issues involving confusion around information and communications, these issues rarely, if ever, make front-page news. It isn't much of an attention grabber, unfortunately. Even his announcement didn't exactly trend in social media. That said, surely the NDP leader is not trying to create confusion in what is already an accessible and easily understood name. There is little doubt that he is aware of accessibility legislation and social goals in this country. Jagmeet Singh seems like an okay guy, and a somewhat refreshing political voice in Canada, so this episode isn't pitching at the man personally. Although I gotta tell you, dude, you look way better when you're showing your long, flowing locks of hair. Anyway, my personal opinion. And as I mentioned, his party, to their credit, is firm on accessibility commitments. However, his apparent enthusiasm in honoring the late Jack Layton seems to have been clouded by a momentary lapse in judgment and understanding about how to achieve accessible information and communication. The name Toronto-Danforth is geographically identifying, plain, and easy to understand, consistent with accessibility standards, both existing and in development, and therefore suitable to remain as a moniker for the riding. And to all political candidates in this election, do your best to steer clear of political gimmickry. Visit stephenchristiansen.ca for more episodes that describe what came before, behind, and between. This podcast is available on all major podcast apps and streaming platforms, including Anchor, Spotify, TuneIn, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Amazon Music. I'm Stephen Christensen, and whoever you vote for in this election, just do your best to actually cast your vote. Thanks for listening.
A production of Stephen Christensen. Podcast complete.